Hey everyone, Juan here. Welcome to SQL Lingua Franca, the podcast about analytics that reveals what the documentation does not cover.
SQL Lingua Franca. Mayo.
Today, we have my colleague Travis here. He's going to talk to us much more about DevOps and its importance about data, and we're also going to talk quite a bit about project management and the impact that it has on teams. Travis, tell me about you as a person.
Sure. I am originally South African. I moved to the Netherlands around 2008, and I live on the edge of Amsterdam. I've married. I have two kids, and in my free time, I like sports, like windsurfing and bouldering. And then actually I code as well in my free time. Like I think a lot of
That's
our
a common
colleagues.
topic for many of us.
Yeah, exactly. So I generally follow the tech world. It's just there's so much, and I can distract myself in lots of ways. And other things I really like, I guess media in many forms. We were discussing. I really love comedy. I love British comedy. And I read a lot as well. So I think that sums up me as
Nice. And I also happen to know that professionally you have been all over the place. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your career?
Sure. So I studied robotics, and I was doing a thesis, master's thesis, and I was essentially my first job I got because they wanted someone to do anomaly detection on industrial motors, basically on the waveforms that we were extracting from those. And because of that, I had to pick up programming. So I learned Delphi, which is a language which is not so much in use anymore. And I've migrated since then all over the place. So that was an IoT system before IoT was a term, and we monitored these massive industrial motors to sort of for preventative maintenance, because of course these things going down could cost a lot of money. And then I shifted into desktop application development. I once developed an app for iOS. I developed in Flash before Steve Jobs actually killed that.
Wow.
Using ActionScript. And then I pivoted. I just pivoted a lot into sort of back-end development, C#, and then I pivoted into front-end development. So I also did like AngularJS development for quite a front-end framework kind of stuff. But I always kind of one of the courses I did at university was there was this guy called Prof. Green who'd introduced. He'd introduced a bunch of engineering students to some AI kind of, I guess, machine learning technologies. It was fuzzy logic, evolutionary algorithms, and neural networks. At that time, we obviously didn't have the compute to do anything significant with them.
Is it rude to ask which year was it?
This is 98, I think. So we were using MATLAB. We had neural networks with, I think, like 6 neurons in them, because that's all you could do in MATLAB. But it was very interesting to kind of see what some of these algorithms could be used to do. And I always thought, like, I'd love to work with these kinds of, with technologies based around these kind of algorithms or statistical models. And but that, in those days when I started, there was no opportunity to actually become a data scientist or machine learning engineer. That didn't really exist.
I think that term came like 15, 20 years later.
Yeah, exactly. Shows how old I am. But then around, let me see what maybe 2015, 2016, sort of data science became popular again, or suddenly we could do it because of the the GPUs and that
Hadoop
compute.
And I think Spark was starting that.
Yeah, sure. I think it's also that the algorithms themselves that that we're using, like random forest and logistic regression, had been around for a long time, but suddenly we could actually use them for real world applications. And I decided to try to pivot towards that. And then was kind of invited to interview at Go Data Driven in those days. But the interview was for a data engineer. And I thought, well, my software engineering background is more suited to some of the data engineering stuff. So instead of like going to data science, I went to data engineering. But then I think the third project I had, which was at Albert Heijn, was a demand forecasting project. And subsequently, a lot of the time that I've spent at Xebia has been focused on projects around machine learning, which is great because that very much ties into what I enjoy doing. And I also discovered that like DevOps, especially things like automation and CI/CD, is something that I really am passionate about. It also comes from my software engineering background. And so a lot of projects, that's where my focus area lies, is how do we get things into production and then make sure that they keep running there. So I often describe myself as a plumber rather than a data engineer, because pipelines are really what I focus on a lot.
That's interesting because I think the whole DevOps revolution happened in programming, but I think it took a time before it started getting into the data world.
Yeah, that's been my experience, and I think that's why it's thought it'd be interesting to have a discussion around this, because I feel like DevOps has been adopted within sort of microservice companies that are using microservice architectures or monolith per se, but there's a lot of sort of techniques that are being used which allow you to deploy things to production multiple times a day, to test in production, to turn things on and off. And, having come from a sort of web developer background and then coming into the sort of data world, I quickly noticed that wasn't as prevalent. And often the way things were being done reminded me of how things were done like 10 years ago as a software engineer.
Being honest, some of my first jobs, it was just SQL script somewhere in a Google Drive, and good luck finding the one you need. Copy and pasting it, and then run the code.
Yeah, that rings bells. Like I remember deployments being, we used IS, and we had to manually copy files into a folder, and then there would be a bunch of folders, and one of these would be like web application version 2 _ copy _ do not delete kind of things. And so, and that was like, that wasn't the cloud, that was a server that was in the basement kind of thing. And then, seeing sort of modern CI/CD techniques coming through and like just reducing the amount of stress that you have. I think you were also sharing about like,
yeah, for sure,
maintaining SQL scripts for a SQL Server instance and how stressful that can be. And I think it's long term. This not only makes the developer experience much nicer following some of these techniques, but it also leads to things breaking less. And it can also increase the speed of your development flow. So I think it's an interesting space to be in. I know MLOps kind of came up and was quite hyped before. We were talking about this earlier as well, but like before LLMs kind of stole the show as such, Gen AI. But I think it's just as relevant and the same as if you're going to be hosting your LM models somewhere, you still have to find ways of how do we productionize them, how do we ensure they keep running successfully. So it's just as relevant.
Yeah, my take on this is we spent a lot of time in the data world pushing every tool to be easier to use. But I think the whole revolution of it's not about things being easy, but things being really maintainable.
Yeah,
it's just starting. And for all of you listening, if you aspire to work for a mature data company, you really need to become good at DevOps. Yeah. I don't think it's a stretch to say that in 10 years, every single data person will need to learn about DevOps. But today, if you aspire to work for a mature data company that already works with a lot of data and knows what they're doing, there is no way around it. You're going to have to get your hands dirty with everything: containers, orchestration, CI testing, and working with the cloud and so on. So I'm very happy to have you and see some of your takes on this topic.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think. I think it's interesting. One of the recent projects that I worked on, which was where we actually rolled out an analytics platform. The platform that was there was purely production context. It was all the notebooks in a certain tool. There was no Git at all. And so we introduced a lot of techniques around there or ways of work, essentially. I think it's important that one of the things one aspect of DevOps is quite important is that it's kind of it's not just tools and not just kind of process. There's actually a cultural sort of philosophy around it. And that means it's not something that you can just, turn on and say like, hey, now we're doing DevOps. And I'm curious actually what your experience is of this, because,
That's so it's interesting because I think defining DevOps tends to be quite difficult. Some people tend to go to the story of like somewhere in the, I think, 90s, this programming revolution started, like the fight between operations and the people coding.
Yeah.
Some people are very reductionist and they sum it up to a mindset, like some core principles like being able to push code without that much manual intervention and automated testing. To me, in very practical terms, and I know this is very simplistic and reductionist, I just care about the core principles. I think projects tend to be much more maintainable when you see version control, when you see containers, orchestrations, and some people would say, oh, but this one also falls into DevOps or DataOps. That's all fine. I just know all of these practices. And you can also say a little bit tools, but really it's more practices.
Exactly, yeah, I agree.
That you put towards making sure that the project is easier to maintain and it breaks less often.
Yeah, sure. I think it's also from a sort of developer perspective. There's the cost and time in developing a solution, and we have ways of doing that, but it has to keep running for a much longer time after the development time is finished. And if there aren't decisions being made in that development phase in terms of, and this does come sometimes to tooling, but it also comes into thinking about things like scalability and reliability and maintainability, then the long-term costs could become massive. I actually had a colleague recently who's trying to help a company with some optimization implementations, and he said he was actually struggling to get to chat to some of the data engineers because they are so busy maintaining the current system, they don't really have time for anything else.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I was like, wow, it sounds like they need to follow some of these sort of DevOps principles, I guess, or practices, because it can also then free people's time up to focus on maybe more important things.
Maybe, Travis, let's make it very visible for everybody. Let's say that you, as an experienced consultant in this topic, you land in a company that is like extremely mature when it comes to data.
Yes.
And it is your job to, let's say, in a year, make sure that they're more mature and that they're adopting more DevOps practices. How do you even get started?
It's a big question.
Well, if you had a very concrete answer, we will be rich.
Sure. I guess, again, I'd like to reflect on this project we worked on because sometimes when we're involved with our clients, we focus a lot on the technology aspect. So and that really comes down to, for data platforms, to infrastructure. And then we try to do that in a way that can be maintained. So we don't do what we like to call ClickOps, where you just, go into whatever cloud portal and click everything together. We try to use tools like Terraform. because essentially that is a great tool for long-term maintenance of your infrastructure. It even prevents doing things manually because it would conflict with the state. And then you can roll that out, and then you can say, hey, look, you have a data platform. But if the people that are there have not adjusted their way of working things, where maybe their way of work is, like I was talking about those notebooks, is maintaining those notebooks, which causes them stress, but they have to do it. Otherwise, this important report that they need to deliver to the CEO cannot be delivered. Then, sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
So you would start with a platform then?
Well, no, I think the point is that you can't just start with a platform, and you can't just let's roll out a platform and look, the platform's on, and now let's move on to the next thing. I think at the same time, you need to start introducing practices and actually define a bunch of, I guess, guidelines to work with. So at this previous client, the one guideline, I didn't come up with this, but I think it's very nice. We came up with was if it's not in Git, it doesn't exist. Which for some tools is kind of interesting because some tools don't have Git. So yeah, you can't put things in Git at all. But that was a good focus to help everyone thinking about like firstly having things in code repositories, but also getting used to this process of creating pull requests, having someone evaluate what they were doing. So basically, not just having silos of people working on things, that there was a process of review, which also takes a bit of an adjustment. There's already a cultural adjustment there. And then having your like continuous integration checks. So like, okay, this pull request needs to run you have to run a bunch of tests to make sure it works. In my opinion, like that's always a nice place to start. Like the CI/CD stuff, which has automation as well, which is also a key aspect, is I think my experience is if that's often been a nice way to get people into a sort of DevOps way of thinking.
Yeah, I agree. So you start working with Git. That probably, to me, if you ask me, is definitely the first step that you should make. But then luckily, if you're using anything, GitHub, GitLab, or whatever managed Git instance that you're working with, they quite often also have the tools for you to start creating CI pipelines to automate some of the processes. And that really opens the door towards like automated testing and CI/CD.
Yeah, exactly.
That's like the gateway drug.
There's different qualities of drugs. I wouldn't say that Azure DevOps is in the same quality as GitLab.
Oh, fair.
So that's I would say that like if I look if you look at some of the best practices of DevOps, so you have like agile project management, which is adapting one way of doing agile, and agile itself. I'm hesitant to talk about because interpretations can vary a lot. I like to go to like the original Agile Manifesto. That's like my source of truth essentially for what is agile. But I know that a lot of people in different contexts have been sort of.
Okay, I'm gonna get in trouble. I think agile is fragile. It depends on having really good people, that like a product owner that has a great vision and a scrum master that understands and is maybe able to take over from the team. It's not bad, but it's hard to do it well. And the thing that people don't understand is any project methodology, be it Scrum or whatever, is better than none. So if this is the first thing that you're trying, it's going to feel like a miracle.
Yeah. So I have quite a. I went through. Maybe it's an interesting topic to discuss. So, at the start of my career, the company I worked for, we were following something called Rational Unified Process, and in theory, it's kind of as an agile aspect. There is a sort of like circular aspect to it, but what it really meant is that we'd do an analysis phase for a month, which as developers we weren't really involved in. So I remember there was a guy I sat next to who developed a game that could play piece of software that could play chess in that time. Like he had enough time to do that. And you know, and then we would go into the design phase, and then we would do the implementation, and all the timelines that had already been defined up front during the analysis phase. Because of course, when you're analyzing what's required for a software project, you can identify all the problems that are going to happen, and nothing would go wrong, right? And also, it was a fairly hierarchical organization. So, you know, I remember one moment when I was trying to get something through, and the CTO dropped by my desk and said, "Hey, could you just implement this piece of software by this afternoon?"
Good luck saying no.
So no product owner, exactly. As a junior engineer, you're not going to say no to the CTO. And then someone actually had traveled and heard about Scrum, and so he came in and introduced doing Scrum, and we weren't doing a very good variation of it, but it made a huge impact to my experience as a developer, because that CTO could no longer just pop by my desk and ask me to, you know, fix the thing. But we had way better structure for how we did things, and we focused on deploying things more regularly. So it had a huge impact on my life, which is also why it's something that is quite dear to me. Subsequent to that time, you know, a lot of companies have made money around trainings, and you've also kind of got things like Scaled Agile Framework, which is a much broader implementation than just, you know, within the team itself. And I understand that you need things like that. And I even have a colleague who reckons that, you know, Agile is just not meant for human beings. Like, kind of comes back to your point there. It's like that you need a certain level of maturity. I still think it's relevant. If you look at the original manifesto, it's there's these 4 things, and I wish I could memorize this, but I have a terrible memory. But it's things like individuals' interactions over processes and tools, like working software over documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. That's really it. So like the values themselves are actually not that complex, and it gives you a lot of room to, like, what does that mean for my context? I think the challenge is often that in a lot of environments, the team doesn't be given the choice or have the autonomy to choose for themselves how they do things. You have things that are pushed from above, like you are now doing Scrum, the stand-up 15 minutes is over, guys. We all need to stop now. We're now going to do story pointing. Let's say a 5 is too high. Let's make it a 3. You know, those kinds of things where the whole autonomy aspect, because I think autonomy there's 2 things. There's autonomy, and then there's inspect and adapt. So basically having a process where you constantly, as a team, can go like, how can we improve things? And then things like transparency, like those are to me like what Agile is to me. And then there's all these other practices which you encounter, and those should all be optional, if I can say.
Yeah, from my experience, I don't mean to say that Scrum is always bad. As a consultant, I've seen 2 companies doing Scrum where everybody could agree, like, wow, our work is much better because of all of this. That's 2 companies.
Yes. And then 98
and
other
then
companies. Sorry.
No, then roughly 5, where I think most of us would argue that everything was being made worse by following, like, indeed, like taking away the autonomy and the ability to change.
Yeah.
And for the rest, was quite okay. But I think the factors that are interesting to identify in the companies where I saw it working is, 1, the product owner had a lot of experience managing projects before. Back then, he picked up the very first Scrum book. So the guy was just like a project manager on steroids. And the Scrum Master, which is supposed to advocate for the team, for us, that person also had like 15, 20 years of experience doing exactly the same job. And there was this understanding that if for whatever reason I'm sick and we really need to, this person could sit on my desk and maybe not do it as well, but do it enough. And that person really internalized all of the pain points and was able to advocate and sometimes we didn't need to tell him how long something would take. He would like build an estimate for himself that was really good. So maybe going back, I think it can work if
Yeah.
you're extremely disciplined and if the key figures in the whole Scrum dynamic are very experienced.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Um,
But yeah, it's 2 out of 100.
and it's also interesting to look at the origins of Scrum is the context in which it was introduced to was kind of like the context I was describing at my first job, and we have changed a lot, or well, not all contexts, unfortunately, but sort of modern development contexts are quite different now than they were 20 years ago. And I actually did my Scrum Master training with Jeff Sutherland, who's one of the guys that wrote the Scrum Guide. And I remember him describing it as like they try to come up with the least bureaucratic structure. So to as essentially to note, like they knew that the context in which this would be introduced would be very bureaucratic context, you know. So they didn't want to like say, well, there's no rules anymore. So they still made it bureaucratic, but they tried to minimize the bureaucracy to as little as possible. And again, for 20 years ago, totally irrelevant. But in a lot of modern development contexts now, we've moved far away from being bureaucratic, and in that sense, like, does it still fit? But anyway, agile practices, I still think there's focusing on getting things into production quickly, iterating, this inspect and adapt thing. I think that is an important part of DevOps. I do think, though, that it's almost become normal.
It's funny because, like, let's not put a name to it,
Sure.
but I never thought of project management as part of DevOps. But I guess that change of mindset also involves becoming better at project management. So
Yeah.
I see why you would include it there, even though it never occurred to me.
Yeah. I think it also links to the cultural part. I think if you have a heavily bureaucratic context with very much like top-down management style, then a lot of these sort of DevOps practices, which again are about culture, like I actually like this. I was reading up a bit about some aspects of DevOps, but like one of the practices that was recommended is change culture. So we identify culture as a part of it, but the points that were identified is things like collaboration, and you're like, okay, of course, collaboration. You don't want silos. Everyone should work together, great. But then things like transparency, trust, and the one that I liked a lot was empathy.
Oh,
which is not something you often identify as something that you need to have in a tech. I mean, we're not very emotional, empathetic people.
no, but to me it makes a lot of sense because it's always like a pipeline of people. You really need a good balance of juniors to seniors to ensure the continuity of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And really good seniors that have a lot of empathy, they're able to know, like, okay, I think this junior is ready for this challenge, or I think this challenge will do good to this junior, or maybe let's pair these two people and make sure they work together. There are some aspects where I do see that being very empathic and understanding the level and what a person needs can be really helpful.
Yeah. Oh, good. I'm actually curious because it's something I've been also thinking about, like what context, and maybe you can ask, well, if you think back to some of the projects you've worked in before and the team context, like what have been the elements that have made it a nice experience to work in that team, if you reflect?
In general, fun.
Any project you've worked on, like,
nice as in pleasant or as in
as
like productive?
in,
They're not always the same.
That's a fair point. Although, yeah.
I can do both, honestly.
Yeah, sure.
So pleasant, it's 100% up to group cohesion. If there is a friendly atmosphere amongst colleagues, and sometimes companies can help by organizing like some drinks on Friday or whatever, but I don't know, maybe you can really not force that.
No.
But if you really enjoy spending time with the people and you appreciate them and admire them and are even cordial to them or friendly, it becomes very pleasant. To me, that's just the only thing. You can have as many ping pong tables and as many pizza Fridays, but just feeling that you have people at work that you don't have to call them your friends, but you enjoy spending time with them makes a massive difference.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to force or replicate that. Productivity wise, well, companies that are like really productive, I think they have, a really good understanding of project management. They have a really clear vision. With all honesty, it's not that I prefer a waterfall,
Yeah.
because bad waterfall is probably worse than many other methods. But those companies that have like that vision of this is exactly where we're going, this is our roadmap, and we have been able to fill in the details, that makes a huge difference. And then quoting an episode before, for me personally, if you get very quick feedback in most of the parts of the process, it's much better. From
Yes.
not having to wait 2
Yeah.
weeks for an account, not having to wait for something, or not having to beg somebody for a license, or even when you run your code, for it to take less than a minute, that's a massive difference. I've also been in environments where every single action would take like 3 hours. So it was like, okay, cross your fingers. Let's hope that everything is correct. And in 3 hours, we'll check this computer again.
Yeah.
And of course, you had like a dedicated computer just for that because you couldn't use your own.
Yeah, that's painful.
So yeah, that will be my things. But maybe, Travis, one topic that we haven't mentioned that I'm very interested is, let's say somebody listening here says like, okay, I want to become really good at DevOps. Where do you start? I think, just to also give context, I think there are 3 levels to this. There is just good enough so that you can like not interfere to what your company's doing. And by that I'm talking like, the 7 magic Git commands, the 3 Docker commands. You're able to read a GitHub Actions workflow and more or less know what's happening. And you are able to read a Terraform file and at least know like the 3 steps of Terraform, what they do. To me, that's the first level. As in like, I know enough to kind of not become a burden to my team. Level 2, which I don't personally think I've been level 2 and I maybe will never get there, is the people that come to a company like, okay, we're going to set things up. I'm going to set up the orchestration, the container, so that the junior can only learn 7 commands and they will be fine. So people that like enable at a larger scale. And then there are the over 100x programmers that are able to say like, oh, you know what? I don't like Hadoop, so I'm going to create Spark. I don't think anybody needs to aspire for the last level. No. Some people would love to be the second, as in being the DevOps person of your company or the platform person or the architect. But I think most of us should aspire to be in level 1 if you work in data and you're serious about it. What are your takes on this?
Yeah. I think for instance that there's different. It's quite broad, and a lot of things jump to mind at once. Let's see which thought comes through first. I think the cultural part. I always think like, okay, maybe because they have, for instance, they used to be I think it's Dora. They basically it's based on research of like I think 20,000 different software engineers and or people working in tech context, let's say, and they would produce these metrics that gave an indication to show how different kinds of DevOps practices actually positively impacted specific contexts.
Interesting.
And it's actually a really interesting report to read, and there's actually now books that have been based on it because it's actual. It's actual evidence, like data, and I mean I can imagine that someone might read this and go, well, I mean actually I read this report when it first came out and I was like, we should do all these things, But then I came back to the context I was in, and I was like, we're not ready to do any of these things. There's all these other things that need to happen first. So I think the main thing, and it comes back more to culture than to the practices themselves, is striving to find a way of work where there is autonomy, so there's trust in the team, and you don't have to have someone from above pushing things. Striving to have that, and the practice that I think is key is the retrospective, essentially having, and you don't have to call it retrospective because it's often associated with Scrum, but
Moment to reflect.
essentially having a regular reflection with everyone together where everyone's voice can be heard at the same level. So not having, one person whose opinion counts more than others, everyone's voices. And then, looking at guys, how can we do things better? And starting there, because then it kind of opens up options for someone to say hey, we keep having to copy these files into the production context. There's this thing called continuous delivery, and there's this tool that we can use in our Azure DevOps context. Maybe we could give that a try. I think that's a more sort of iterative approach to doing these things than a big bang okay, let's just start using this tool and that tool, and maybe even saying Git above everything needs to be in Git. So it's a combination of things, and you're talking about the levels. So I wasn't quite sure. You're saying are you asking which level should you aspire to, or
if you say it like that, but to me there are always 3 tiers of knowing DevOps, and
okay,
maybe I'm a bit too extreme with this, but I think most data professionals should aspire to at least know the basics, not to become a burden to
yeah, I would say, but so there's actually a lot of there's some very good books. Actually, one that I can recommend is the Phoenix Project, where it's written as a novel. So instead of a lot of tech books where you just have a lot of very dry theoretical content, the Phoenix Project looks at a real world example, and essentially it shows how DevOps practices can be introduced. The main character is quite funny. But I would, there's a lot of good material out there where you can just, start becoming familiar with it. But I do think it's always contextual, these things. And so, you can learn these practices, but depending on what is possible, and also how your team around you is willing to adopt them, can determine how things are going. Actually, before I left my last client, I never got the opportunity to give a talk on it, but I really wanted to focus on. We focused. Maybe I just talk a little bit about that. So, a couple of practices that we introduced there, which made quite a big impact on things, and also, I think, introduced DevOps as a concept to the team we were working with. The one that actually was for me the first time is RFCs and ADRs, request for comment. So essentially, where you were talking about companies that do well because they design things and they have kind of a roadmap. I think design is important. I feel that sometimes in context where people are doing agile, it kind of gets left out because people think, well, design, then we're doing waterfall, right? Because you start designing and then you. I think design is just as important, and so we, this RFC thing is where you actually record the design that you want to have. You put forward different options, and then you make it a discussable thing. And so that was one thing. Retrospectives, that actually, that's actually why I mentioned it, but also that made a big difference. Sitting together, team, saying, hey, let's be open with each other. If you're not feeling great about things, then please say it. That's a really good one. roadmaps are another one. Like I took on a quasi product owner role, and roadmaps I've always seen as like this corporate thing, like vague PowerPoint presentation. But actually having a roadmap and can be really useful for focusing your development. So it's not per se a DevOps thing. That's more of just a general development practice, I guess. But that got us to the point where we developed a new platform. We were actually migrating from an old platform. The next thing I wanted to focus on was the ops part, and I think that's where I see a difference between data projects and sort of classic software engineering projects. Is often the products you're developing or the platform you're developing, unless you're in a modern IT context, and even then it's not per se the same. It's the people that are doing IT, that are maintaining the existing operational systems, aren't experienced with the tooling that you're using for your analytics stuff. I'm curious actually what your experience has been of that, because that's something I've noticed is like IT, okay, here's our Kubernetes cluster, we're doing microservices and like service bus and all these other things, and you're like Databricks, Spark, and then DBT, like they
and BI tools and everything.
Yes.
My experience is, yes, quite often the best developer, like the most experienced programmer, ends up being data person, ends up being the de facto admin of all of these tools. Even though that's like a major conflict of interest. Like, ideally, it's another person, the one doing the administration and the like issuing licenses, onboarding other people, ensuring quality, everything. But because it's even very hard to ask from us as the developers to learn all of these tools. It's even harder for somebody that doesn't even work with the data to know how to admin them or what are the requirements. So I've been admin of all sorts of databases, all sorts of BI tools, and even tools that I don't even know how to use properly.
Yeah, right. And this talk that I wanted to give, kind of, at least to this previous client of mine, the reality was that though they had an IT section and they also had a DevOps team, which I always think is a bit of a, well, if you have a team called the DevOps team, then you're kind of missing the whole lining between the developers and operations people, but fine. But they were quite experienced and quite good at setting up the deployment configurations and maintaining, like they also would do maintaining some of the infrastructure. But the setup of the data platform they hadn't been involved in, which meant that the data team, which is analytics engineers, they then had to take on the ops of that thing. And ops is hard, as I think you've experienced, and it's not something that you often have training for or have experience with. And there's a lot of like well-known practices around that, but on top of knowing all of these other tooling that you need to do modeling or to generate reports or to, get stuff out of the data, it's quite a big ask. And so that's also interesting to think about, like, okay, how can we also do ops as data professionals? Like, what does that mean? Like, how does that look?
Yeah, it's hard. Like, learning how to deploy things, it's a skill on its own. And I don't think most of the data world is fully prepared to do that. Like, programmers that's really part of their training. But for us, it's just, quite often I'm just looking at programming tutorials to learn things.
It's also, I don't know if you find, but I find it a bit more challenging sometimes with data, because like one of the projects I worked on, we had it was a feature generation, but we did it on point of sale data, DBT. It took 6 hours to run. And if something was broken and you needed to rerun it, that takes another 6 hours. And a lot of like what you read about with DevOps is like, we can deploy multiple things a day, and like with feature flags, you have this idea where you can turn something on, and if it doesn't work, or we try it out, you deploy it to a subset of your users, and then they give you feedback. Yeah, that doesn't work with a massive pipeline that takes 6 hours. It's you need to generate that data, but you know, if it breaks, if you've missed something, then what do you do?
That's true. And I think another interesting difference between traditional programming and data is it's easier to explain I need this and for traditional programmers to find out how to do it technologically possible. But in the world of data, I could be wrong with this. But I think that it's an iterative process to know where exactly you want to go.
I definitely agree. Yes.
Like they have some vague requirements like, oh, we need more info about this, and it's always a conversation. You give them a dashboard, they said, yeah, this more or less, and then you start iterating on like data projects. I've once again with the numbers, I've only been at one company where I got handed off like a very specific blueprint and you need to deliver this. And almost every question I had was somewhere in that, I think it was 120 slide presentation.
Yeah.
Quite often it's a conversation, not like a very strict set of requirements from the beginning that are not going to change.
Is it because we haven't there isn't a well-established way of doing things, or is it because we just have so many tooling options that every context that you're in has a different way of doing things, and then you're kind of having to reinvent the wheel?
So I think because with traditional software development, it's much easier for technology to adapt to a process. Like if you're taken to a company like, hey, this is what we do and this is how we're currently doing it by hand, programmer can say, okay, thank you for the showing me how this works. I think we could automate this one process. But data is a thing on its own, and analyzing data or getting strategic advantage out of data products is not something that has a real world equivalent. So we're just creating essentially like a new process or a new way of working that it's not that we're per se making it easier, but we're adding a bit more with the promise of if we work a lot with data, we could automate some of the processes and make your life easier. But quite often it's about like, hey, if you look at this dashboard, you're going to take better decisions.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about some of the different kinds of sources that we need to ingest from, and how each source has its own particular challenge. You know, schema types. Does it even have a schema? I think I also often think about like, you know, we're building on top of, I mean, there's an operational data layer that's being developed and maintained by someone else, and we're building this stack of layers on top, and then if something breaks at the bottom, it like disrupts everything on top of it. Yeah. I think that adds quite a challenging element to this kind of thing. And then you have like analytics projects that are built like on the right at the top of that stack, or data science solutions. It's actually amazing sometimes that more things don't go wrong than what works.
Yeah, and what I say is, while testing, one of the most difficult challenges is being able to separate this broke because of something dumb I did versus this broke because I assumed that what I was getting from the teams before me was going to always work in this way. And so it's hard to say like, oh yes, I did something dumb, like this logic is incorrect, but I have 100% autonomy to fix it versus I was not expecting that they were going to add another column to the schema like 3 or 5 teams ago.
Yeah, exactly. That's been my experience as well. In fact, in one of my previous projects, we were ingesting directly from SQL Server instances, and they kept changing the schemas without telling us, and eventually we had to kind of get someone, we had to escalate to the point where on a Confluence page they would announce, if they remembered, what schema changes that they were doing. But you know, it was based on from our perspective, I think an unrealistic expectation that this would remain static, and it didn't. I mean, it's not surprising. But yeah, these are the kind of challenges that you have to address, and that is a very specific challenge for that specific context. Of course, we have tooling for checking data quality, but there's no one size fits all when it comes to data tooling, and so every context has its own challenge. Maybe you could pivot a little bit, well, not pivot per se, but I was the ops aspect. I think one thing that really opened my eyes. It's something I had worked with or configured before, but basically monitoring. That was something I've discovered that is often implemented too late in projects, and maybe it's a general thing. I think often when you're developing something new, the scale remains small, so it becomes it's a lot less. It costs a lot less energy and effort to maintain it. Maybe it's one Databricks job or 3 Databricks jobs. So if it fails, you get an email, Databricks job failed, and you're like, oh, the thing failed. What I experienced, though, is that you can very quickly scale to 200 Databricks jobs, and then going through each job to check the logs becomes, quite a tedious thing for someone to do. And that's where I feel like, and then then you have a monitoring solution, and you find ways of aggregating the logs. And but at least some of the projects I've been on, my experience has been that often monitoring is added in a bit too late. And I think monitoring from the ops perspective is one of the things that I see as being fairly critical. The other thing, though, that I also be curious to if you have experience with this.
Sure.
There's this thing called alert fatigue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think the problem is we get alerts, but they're definitely not actionable. It's the same with dashboards. Sometimes it's just like, pretty numbers and some safety just knowing that you're going to get an alert. But really good alerts are the ones that go to the right person. Like, hey, you are supposed to know about this and you're supposed to fix it.
Yeah.
This is what happened. This is how you can fix it. And this is the priority. Yeah. If you give every alert to send it to everyone in the data team with no consideration, that's never going to work. Yeah. But if you get at least once a week an email that has like the alert emoji and it says, hey, you have been assigned to this and this is critical and we already notify your manager that you're going to drop whatever you're doing because this needs to get fixed in 3 days.
That's quite an advanced implementation.
I mean, what I'm saying is also a bit futuristic and out of this world.
Sounds good. We could use GenAI for that.
Yeah, well, the problem is most companies don't do the ownership part really well. But when they do, and you get like very targeted alerts like that, that makes a difference.
Exactly, and I think it's actually. I'm a big fan of dashboarding because dashboarding gives you it also ties in well with analytics context because there's often people who are very good at thinking about dashboards for monitoring your systems, but there you can have you can use simple designs like red and green to make it much clearer where things are failing and where things are not failing, but you also can see it over time. I think that time element is quite nice. But I'm always surprised by how, in a lot of contexts I've been in, there's a warning that in one particular system that's just been there, or an exception even, that's been raised there, and you ask someone hey, is this exception? Oh no, it's always done that. And you're but how can you? Why doesn't someone fix it? Don't know. Because the point, of course, is if a real exception comes through, there's a chance that someone just says, I'm used to seeing the word exception there, so I'm going to ignore it. And these are things that I think people in operational context will say we have this is something that we know well, and these are some of the ways of catering for these kinds of challenges. But we coming from developer contexts or data science or let's just say developer, but because we aren't familiar with, our focus is often in the beginning phase of the project where we're making something, and we have less experience with the long-term operational aspect. But now we're expected to do that. And that's...
So Travis, we're running out of time, but
sure.
My perspective there is if you really want to learn how to do these things properly, look at other industries that have something to lose. So, for example, if you want to become really good at Planner, check with the people that do skyscrapers. Those people need those. That's like the ultimate waterfall project. And if you do something slightly wrong, like that thing falls and it's a catastrophe. But in terms of alerts, it's also very interesting what the aviation industry does,
Okay.
because they have already thought about ways in which like you make sure that alerts that people don't get tired with them, that you give them priority, and they always have a person assigned to do this. And so
That's interesting.
the way that pilots prepare for a flight is definitely very interesting to check. And for testing, it's really interesting to see the medical field.
Yes.
Like when a statistical significance is like alpha of 95,
Yeah.
people could die. So a lot of medical fields, they go for a statistical significance that it's outside of this world. To me, looking at those fields that really have a stake and something to lose, it's really interesting, and we should be adopting more stuff. Just like by looking at what programmers were doing for maintainability, reliability, we decided to create data ops.
Yeah.
I think we still have plenty of things that we can learn from other professions.
Agreed. And I think there's still a way to go in this field, which also makes it interesting because then there's things to learn and new things to discover in that sense.
And maybe to wrap it up, Travis, for those of you listening that says, yes, I want to learn much more about DevOps, what are your tips for people to get started and learn?
So I mentioned that book, the Phoenix Project. I can't remember the author's name, but he's also written other books focused around the topic of DevOps. So in that space, I think there's some really good material to become familiar with it. I think actually Atlassian has some because Atlassian focuses on developing tools to support DevOps. So it's in their interests to actually talk about the topic. They have some pretty good overviews to introduce people to, what is DevOps. I would say those two options are actually a good way just to kind of get into it and discover more.
For sure. I will definitely put those ones in the description of this video for everybody that wants to see it. But with that said, thank you so much. It's been a really great and interesting episode.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been fun. Time flew by.